What if I told you that you can rewire your brain? Not in a metaphorical sense, not as a self-help slogan, but literally, biologically, structurally. The human brain is not fixed, it's dynamic, adaptive, and waiting for your input. Every thought you have, every behavior you repeat, every emotion you feel, it's sculpting the neural architecture of your mind. This isn't magic, it's neuroscience. And today, I want to show you how to change your brain so you can change your life. The idea that the brain can change itself used to be considered impossible. For most of the 20th century, neuroscience believed that the adult brain was fixed, that after childhood, the architecture of the brain was set like concrete. You were told that your intelligence, your habits, your personality, even your limitations were largely predetermined and hardwired. But over the last few decades, a revolution in brain science has overturned that assumption completely. We now know without question that the brain is plastic, meaning it can change. It rewires itself in response to experience, attention, and intention. This capacity is called neuroplasticity, and it is the foundation for all learning, all memory, all behavioral change, and ultimately, all personal growth. Neuroplasticity isn't something that happens only when we're children. It is not confined to early development or critical learning periods in youth. While it's true that the brain is more malleable during certain windows, especially during childhood and adolescence, what research clearly shows is that plasticity continues throughout life. Your brain is responding, right now, to how you're listening, what you're thinking about, and even how emotionally engaged you are with what I'm saying. Neurons that fire together wire together, and what you do repeatedly becomes not just what you're good at, but who you are, because the brain physically changes to reflect your patterns of thought and action. Let's take this a step deeper. Every skill you've ever learned, whether riding a bike, playing an instrument, or learning a language, has left a physical trace in your brain. New connections were formed between neurons. Some were strengthened, others weakened. That's plasticity. And this same process happens when you change your habits, when you confront a fear, when you shift a belief you've held for years. The brain is not a container that gets filled up with knowledge. It's a living network that gets sculpted by experience, pruned, rewired, and reshaped constantly. But there's a catch. Neuroplasticity is always happening. Which means that if you're not actively guiding it, your brain will still change, just not necessarily in the direction you want. Bad habits, reinforced, negative thinking, strengthened, chronic stress, etched into your neural circuitry. In other words, your brain is plastic, but it's not always smart. It simply reinforces what you repeat. That's why awareness and intentionality are so critical, because the more deliberate you are about what you practice, mentally and physically, the more powerful the change. One of the most hopeful findings in recent neuroscience is that even serious brain injuries, trauma, or age-related decline don't necessarily spell permanent loss. Stroke patients who once couldn't speak or move certain limbs have regained function through intense repetition and focus. Brain scans show that entirely new regions can take over the functions of damaged areas. In aging adults, targeted learning and regular engagement with novel tasks have been shown to boost brain volume and enhance cognitive performance. All of this is due to the brain's remarkable ability to adapt, to grow, and to reconfigure itself based on input. What this means for you is profound. It means that you are not stuck. You are not your past. You are not limited by what you've been told you are. You are the sculptor of your own mind. Every time you make a decision to focus, to learn something new, to break a pattern, you are changing your brain. It may not feel like it in the moment, but underneath your awareness, neurons are firing, circuits are adjusting, and your future self is being shaped. The idea of neuroplasticity isn't just a scientific curiosity, it's a call to action. It means that your brain is waiting for you to give it a signal. And the more consistent, focused, and intentional that signal is, the more powerful the change will be. It's not instant. It takes repetition, emotion, and rest, but it works. And once you understand that, once you really grasp that the brain is a living system you can direct, you no longer need to ask if you can change. The only question is, what will you choose to become? Every thought you have is not just an abstract idea floating somewhere in your mind. It is a real, measurable physical event occurring in your brain. When you think, neurons fire, These neurons communicate through electrical impulses and chemical signals, creating patterns of activity that reflect your internal mental state. These patterns are not random, they follow circuits that have been strengthened over time through repetition and association. The more you think a certain thought, the easier it becomes to think it again, because the neural pathway that supports it becomes more efficient, more stable, and more dominant. This means that your thoughts are not passive reflections of who you are, they are active participants in shaping who you become. Each time you revisit a certain thought, whether it's empowering or self-defeating, you are reinforcing the circuits that produce that thought. Over time, these patterns can become so strong, so automatic, that they start to define your reality. You begin to believe, "This is just who I am," when in fact it's just what your brain has gotten good at doing. If you constantly think, "I'm not good enough," or "I'll never change," you are not only reinforcing that belief psychologically, you are wiring it into the very fabric of your neural network. And the brain, in its incredible efficiency, will start to anticipate and even seek out situations that confirm those thoughts, because it has been trained to prioritize them. The implications of this are massive. It means that changing the way you think is not just about being positive or motivated, it's about literally building new physical structures in the brain. And the process is the same as building a muscle: repetition, intensity, and time. If you want to cultivate new ways of thinking, whether it's more confidence, more gratitude, more focus, or more resilience, you have to practice those thoughts like you would a skill. You have to return to them again and again, even when it feels forced or unnatural. Because in the beginning, it is. You're creating new pathways in the brain, and those paths don't get built overnight, but they do get built. There is a well-established concept in neuroscience called Hebb's rule: neurons that fire together, wire together. What this means is that the more often two neurons are activated in sequence, like thinking a thought and feeling an emotion, the stronger the connection between them becomes. Over time, this leads to the formation of networks that can operate automatically. This is why certain thoughts can trigger immediate emotional reactions, not because those emotions are inevitable, but because the brain has linked them through repetition. Think of it like a mental shortcut. The more times you walk a path through the woods, the clearer and more accessible that path becomes. Your brain works the same way. It builds shortcuts to save energy, but it builds those shortcuts based on what you've practiced, not what's true or useful. This is also why changing your internal narrative, the story you tell yourself, is such a powerful way to change your brain. If you tell yourself every day that you're someone who follows through, someone who learns quickly, someone who gets stronger from setbacks, then those thoughts aren't just motivating ideas, they're instructions to your brain, they're programming. And with enough consistency, your brain will start to reconfigure itself to support that identity. You'll start noticing opportunities to take action, you'll respond differently to challenges. You'll feel different, not because you faked it, but because your brain has adapted to support the new narrative. Now, it's important to understand that this isn't about lying to yourself or pretending everything is fine when it's not. It's about choosing what to focus on and what to reinforce. Your brain can't tell the difference between a real experience and a vividly imagined one. The same circuits fire either way. This is why visualization is so powerful. When you vividly imagine a future version of yourself succeeding, solving a problem, or performing with confidence, you're activating the same circuits that would be engaged in real life. You're rehearsing success neurologically, and over time that rehearsal becomes familiarity, and that familiarity becomes behavior. There's another layer to this as well. Thoughts can actually change the levels of neurotransmitters and hormones in your body. A single thought can trigger the release of cortisol, adrenaline, dopamine, or serotonin, all of which affect your mood, your energy, your focus, and even your immune system. This is not a metaphor. This is physiology. The mind and body are not separate. What you think determines what you feel, and what you feel determines how you behave. And because behavior feeds back into thought, you enter a feedback loop, either a virtuous cycle of growth or a destructive cycle of self-limitation. So if you want to change your life, you must begin by taking responsibility for your thoughts, not by blaming yourself for having negative ones, but by recognizing that you are not your thoughts. You are the observer. You are the architect. And you have the ability and the responsibility to shape the thoughts that shape your brain. That means curating your mental diet, just like you would your physical one. What are you feeding your mind? What do you read? What do you watch? Who do you spend time with? Every piece of input is shaping the architecture of your brain. Ultimately, the message is this: your thoughts are not invisible. They are not inconsequential. They are sculpting the most powerful organ in your body, moment by moment. And when you learn to direct those thoughts with awareness and consistency, you gain the power to not only change your brain, but to change who you are. Your brain is exquisitely tuned to one thing above all else. Where you place your attention, whatever you focus on, your brain begins to prioritize. It doesn't matter whether that focus is helpful or harmful, positive or negative. Your brain doesn't make that judgment. It simply adapts. Attention is like a spotlight, and where that spotlight shines, neurons start firing more frequently, pathways get stronger, and circuits begin to form or solidify. Over time, this repeated focus creates structural and functional changes in your brain, determining what you notice, how you think, what you feel, and how you respond to the world. When you understand this, you realize that attention is not just a passive experience, it's a creative force. It's the steering wheel of the brain. You can point it in any direction you choose, and wherever you direct it, that area of the brain becomes more active and more connected. The more you focus on something, an idea, a skill, a memory, a fear, the more real and dominant it becomes in your mental landscape. The brain follows your focus like a compass needle pointing north, and with enough repetition, it starts to filter out everything else. It begins to prune away the circuits that aren't being used and strengthen the ones that are. This is why what you pay attention to quite literally shapes your reality. If you constantly focus on problems, your brain becomes better at detecting them, even when they're small or hypothetical. If you consistently focus on gratitude, your brain starts to tune into the positive, not because you're ignoring problems, but because you're training your nervous system to notice what's good. This is not wishful thinking or toxic positivity, it's neuroscience. The reticular activating system, a network in your brainstem, acts like a filter for your sensory input. It lets in what's relevant to your goals, your beliefs, and most importantly, your focus. When you focus on something consistently, the brain starts to treat it as important, and suddenly, your world begins to change. You see more of what you're looking for, but focus isn't just about what you think about. It's also about what you choose to ignore. In a world overflowing with information, the ability to direct your attention, and just as crucially to protect it, is perhaps the most powerful skill you can develop. Every time you check your phone, switch tasks, scroll endlessly, or let your mind jump from one stimulation to another, you're not just losing time, you're training your brain to be distracted. You're reinforcing shallow, fragmented circuits that make deep work, deep relationships, and deep insight harder to access. And the opposite is true as well. When you sustain your attention on one thing, a problem you're solving, a piece of music you're listening to, a person you're truly present with, you're strengthening the circuits of clarity, patience, and insight. There's also a deep biological link between focus and learning. When you focus intently on something, especially when it's challenging, your brain releases neurochemicals like acetylcholine and norepinephrine. These chemicals act like highlighters, tagging that moment as important and signaling to the brain, this is worth remembering. Strengthen these connections. This is why multitasking is so detrimental to learning. Not because you're lazy or disorganized, but because your brain doesn't get the neurochemical message that any one thing is important. It just sees noise. True neuroplastic change, the kind that leads to mastery, growth, and transformation, requires focused attention over time. Emotions also play a crucial role here. When your focus is emotionally charged, whether it's excitement, fear, awe, or even frustration, it has a much stronger impact on the brain. Emotional focus turbocharges learning and memory. That's why you can remember where you were when something dramatic happened years ago, but can't recall what you ate for lunch last Tuesday. The emotional significance of an experience captures your full attention, embedding it deeply in your neural network. So if you want to change your brain more effectively, don't just focus passively, engage emotionally. Attach meaning to what you're learning or practicing, let it matter to you. Attention is also trainable. Just like you can strengthen a muscle at the gym, you can train your brain to focus better through consistent practice. Mindfulness, meditation, deep reading, and even breathwork are powerful tools for sharpening focus and strengthening the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain responsible for conscious decision-making and self-control. When you train attention, you're not just getting better at focusing, you're gaining more control over your behavior, your thoughts, and your life. And in a distracted world, that control becomes a kind of superpower. What's more, your focus is contagious. The way you show up in a room, the way you listen to someone, the way you immerse yourself in your work, it sends a signal to others, it inspires, it elevates, and it cultivates depth in a culture that often rewards surface. If you want to lead, if you want to create, if you want to leave a lasting impact, cultivate the kind of focus that commands attention not through noise, but through presence. So the question isn't whether your brain will follow your focus, it will. The question is, what are you consistently focusing on? What mental diet are you feeding your brain? Because your focus today is sculpting your brain tomorrow. And with that awareness comes responsibility and incredible power. The power to direct your own evolution. The power to change not just how your brain works, but what kind of person you become. One of the most powerful and often misunderstood principles in neuroscience is the relationship between behavior and belief. Most people wait until they feel motivated, inspired, or confident before they take action. They assume that internal states like belief, motivation, or clarity must come first, and only then will they be ready to act. But this assumption is backwards. In fact, the latest neuroscience tells us something radically different. Behavior often comes before belief. What you do changes what you think, how you feel, and even who you believe you are. When you take action, even small action, you activate brain circuits that begin to reshape your internal state. You start building evidence. You begin to create a new feedback loop. For example, if you go for a run even when you don't feel like it, you're not just getting the physical benefits of the exercise. You're also sending a powerful signal to your brain. I am the kind of person who follows through. That signal starts to get wired in, and over time your identity begins to shift. You may have started that run feeling lazy or unmotivated, but by the end your brain has released dopamine, endorphins, and norepinephrine, chemicals that elevate your mood, sharpen your focus, and reinforce the behavior. And the next time you're faced with that same choice, the neural pathway to action is a little bit stronger. This process isn't limited to exercise, it applies to anything. Learning a skill, having a difficult conversation, pursuing a goal, or building a new habit. The moment you take even the smallest step towards something, your brain starts to adjust its internal models. It begins to update your self-image based on what you're doing, not just what you're thinking. And this creates a loop. Action leads to small wins. Those wins build confidence, and that confidence fuels further action. Over time, that loop can transform your beliefs entirely. It's important to understand that your brain is constantly updating its understanding of the world and of you, based on prediction and outcome. This system, often called predictive processing, is a fundamental part of how we learn and adapt. Your brain is always making predictions about what will happen if you take a certain action, and then updating those predictions based on what actually happens. When you behave in a way that contradicts your old beliefs, like showing up confidently even if you feel unsure, and the outcome is positive, your brain begins to revise the old narrative. It says, maybe I'm not as anxious as I thought, or maybe I can handle this. But if you wait to feel different before acting, you're reinforcing the old model. You're teaching your brain that your current feelings define your potential. This is especially critical when trying to break old habits or overcome fear. Fear is a protective mechanism. It keeps you from danger, but it also keeps you from change. And fear isn't just emotional, it's deeply physical. It shows up in your heartbeat, your breathing, your posture. But when you act despite fear, when you speak up, take the risk, or move forward anyway, you're overriding that fear circuit. You're teaching your nervous system that it's safe to act. And with repetition, that fear signal starts to weaken. Your behavior rewires your threat response. You become less reactive, more resilient, and more free. This is why deliberate, goal-oriented action is so powerful for changing your brain. It gives your nervous system new data, fresh evidence to contradict the limiting beliefs you've carried for years. And this data is more persuasive than any affirmation, more enduring than any pep talk. Because your brain believes what you do. Behavior is the language your brain understands best. There's a practical takeaway here that's simple but profound. Don't wait. Don't wait until you feel ready, because readiness is often the result of action, not the prerequisite for it. If you want to become a reader, start reading one page. If you want to be confident in public speaking, start by saying one sentence out loud. If you want to change your mindset, start with a single intentional behavior that aligns with the identity you want to build. Let your actions lead the way. Even small actions can trigger massive internal changes over time. That's because your brain is not looking for dramatic breakthroughs, it's looking for patterns. Repeated behaviors, even if they seem minor, are what create long-term change. And those behaviors don't just reinforce your goals, they rewrite your story. The more consistently you act in alignment with the person you want to become, the more your brain accepts that version as real. Eventually it stops being effort, it becomes your default. The great irony is that many people wait for belief to act, but belief is most often the result of action. If you want to feel confident, act confidently. If you want to believe you're capable, do the things that capable people do. The feelings will follow. Your internal state is not fixed, it's reactive, plastic and responsive to what you do. So if you want to change your brain, if you want to change your identity, start with behavior. Start small, stay consistent, and let action rewire belief. Your environment is not just a backdrop to your life, it is one of the most powerful and underestimated forces shaping your brain. Every sound, color, smell, interaction, and even the layout of the space you're in sends constant input to your nervous system, triggering responses that influence your thoughts, emotions, and behaviors, often without your conscious awareness. Your brain is in a perpetual state of adaptation, constantly interpreting its surroundings and adjusting your internal state accordingly. It was designed this way for survival. In nature, being attuned to your environment was a matter of life or death. But in modern life, this sensitivity means that your environment can either work for you or against you, either reinforcing growth or perpetuating limitation. Consider how your physical surroundings affect your ability to focus. A cluttered, noisy, or chaotic space doesn't just distract you in the moment. It conditions your brain to expect distraction. The constant visual noise forces your brain to process more stimuli, increasing cognitive load and reducing the bandwidth available for deep thinking. Over time, your brain becomes less adept at concentrating, more susceptible to stress, and more dependent on external stimulation. On the other hand, an organized, calming space signals safety, order, and control. It lowers your threat response, activates your parasympathetic nervous system, and makes it easier to focus, reflect, and be creative. The simple act of tidying up or curating a space for intention, whether it's for work, rest, or creativity, can lead to measurable changes in your brain state, your productivity, and your emotional regulation. The people in your environment are just as influential, if not more so. Human brains are wired for social connection. We have mirror neurons that activate when we observe others, especially those we are close to or spend time with regularly. This means that moods, habits, and even beliefs are contagious. If you spend time around people who are negative, cynical, or passive, your brain will begin to mirror those patterns, not because you consciously choose them, but because your brain is designed to adapt to the tribe. This was an evolutionary advantage in a tribal world. Fitting in increased your chance of survival. But in the modern world, it means that your social circle can either pull you upward or hold you back. If you surround yourself with people who are curious, growth-oriented, and emotionally intelligent, your brain starts to shift in that direction. You internalize their mindset, their emotional tone, and even their vocabulary. It's not about copying others, it's about tuning your nervous system to a higher frequency. Even subtle environmental cues, like what books are visible in your space, what apps are on your phone's home screen, or what notifications you receive, shape your attention and ultimately your identity. The average person unlocks their phone dozens of times per day. Each time you do, you're reinforcing a pattern, training your brain to seek stimulation, distraction, or validation. But with awareness, you can reclaim control. You can design your digital environment to support the brain states you want to cultivate. That might mean limiting your access to apps that trigger comparison or anxiety, or creating intentional spaces for reading, reflection, or focused work. When your environment aligns with your intentions, you don't have to rely as much on discipline. Your surroundings begin to pull you in the right direction. There's also a biological basis for how the environment shapes your brain. When you experience novelty, a new place, a new sound, a new challenge, your brain releases dopamine, the chemical of motivation and learning. Novel environments increase neuroplasticity by signaling to the brain, "This is important, pay attention." Adapt. This is why travel, or even changing your daily route, can enhance creativity and problem solving. But the opposite is also true. When your environment becomes too familiar and predictable, your brain shifts into energy conservation mode. It stops seeking new connections. It stops growing. This doesn't mean you need constant stimulation. In fact, that can be counterproductive, but it does mean that deliberate variation, curiosity, and freshness in your environment can keep your brain more flexible and resilient. Your environment also includes the internal atmosphere you cultivate, your rituals, your routines, your systems. The brain thrives on rhythm and predictability. When you create rituals around waking up, working, resting, or winding down, you send clear signals to your nervous system about what to expect. These rituals reduce cognitive load, improve emotional regulation, and create a stable foundation for peak performance. Even something as simple as lighting a candle, playing a certain kind of music, or changing your posture can prime your brain for a different mode, whether it's focus, reflection, or restoration. Ultimately, the environments you create are extensions of your intention. They're physical expressions of what you value, what you prioritize, and what you're becoming. And because your brain is constantly adapting to those cues, shaping your environment becomes one of the most practical, powerful ways to shape your brain. You don't have to rely on willpower alone. You can surround yourself with the kinds of stimuli, people, and patterns that naturally bring out your best. When you align your external world with your internal goals, you create a synergy that accelerates change. Your environment stops being something that happens to you and becomes something you design. And when you design it with intention, you're not just changing your surroundings, you're changing your brain. Sleep is not merely a time of rest. It is a critical period of intense neurological activity, where the brain engages in essential processes that directly affect your memory, mood, decision-making, emotional regulation, and even your capacity to change and adapt. The common idea that sleep is passive could not be more misleading. During sleep, your brain is actively consolidating the information you've taken in during the day, pruning unnecessary connections, strengthening the ones you need, and essentially reorganizing itself for better function. Without quality sleep, any attempt to change your brain, whether through learning, habit building, therapy, or physical training, is significantly compromised. Your brain operates through electrical activity and chemical communication, and sleep is the time when both of these systems undergo calibration. One of the most important processes that takes place during sleep is memory consolidation. When you're awake, you gather information, form experiences, and encounter emotional situations. But it is during sleep, particularly during deep non-REM sleep and REM sleep, that your brain sorts through this data, deciding what to keep, what to discard, and how to organize it. New connections are formed, and existing ones are strengthened in ways that improve recall, learning, and problem solving. Without enough quality sleep, even if you spend hours studying or practicing a skill, your brain will fail to effectively encode and retain the information. This is why sleep is as critical to learning as the learning itself. Moreover, sleep is essential for emotional resilience. When you're sleep deprived, the amygdala, the brain's threat detection center, becomes hyperactive, while the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for rational thinking and impulse control, becomes less active. This imbalance creates a brain that is more reactive, more anxious, and more prone to emotional volatility. In contrast, adequate sleep restores emotional balance. It allows the brain to process difficult emotions, resolve internal conflicts, and reset mood-regulating neurotransmitters. After a full night of sleep, people often find that problems seem more manageable, thoughts are clearer, and feelings are less overwhelming. This is not just subjective, it's physiological. Sleep acts as an emotional reset button, giving the brain a chance to heal and reframe experiences in healthier ways. Sleep also supports neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change and adapt. When you're learning something new, trying to overcome a limiting belief, or working to develop a new habit, you are literally asking your brain to rewire itself. That rewiring depends on repeated activation of certain neural circuits, but just as importantly, it depends on the brain's ability to stabilize those changes. Sleep is where this stabilization happens. During sleep, especially the slow wave phases of non-REM sleep, The brain replays patterns of neural activity.